It all started with an unusual call to the phone of a journalist named Max. As always busy, he was in a hurry to complete his report that day and was about to leave when he suddenly received a call from an anonymous source. The stranger on the other end of the line was speaking haltingly but confidently. "Max, do you know what's going on in an abandoned house on the outskirts? No matter what you think, just go there. You can't pass it by." The journalist reacted with doubt to the words of the anonymous person. Abandoned houses were not uncommon in the area, where several buildings remained dilapidated and completely unattended after the financial crisis. However, the stranger's tone was insistent, as if he knew something, and moreover, he was able to convince. Already late in the evening, after a busy day at work, Max accepted this strange invitation, deciding that in the worst case, he would simply return with nothing. The next day, when he went to the place, he took with him only a camera, a notebook, and a flashlight, deciding that in a few hours he would be able to explore the house and check what was so interesting there. He did not know that this report would turn into a nightmare for him. The house stood on the edge of a quiet street, surrounded by a forest, and now it seemed even more frightening. The windows were boarded up, but dim light filtered through the cracks. Someone was clearly trying to hide what was happening inside, but with minimal effort. When Max got closer, he noticed that the door was ajar, as if it was waiting for him. A light draft was blowing from somewhere inside, urging him to come in. Everything inside was covered with a layer of dust. There was a musty smell in the air, which caused a slight dizziness, but Max, trying not to lose concentration, turned on the flashlight and began to carefully inspect the room. At first glance, there is nothing unusual: the remains of furniture, several discarded boxes, and books lying around. However, his attention was soon attracted by the stairs leading to the attic. The steps were covered with stains that at first seemed to him to be traces of rust, but on closer inspection they looked more like dried blood. Max felt growing uneasiness, but professional interest forced him to move on. He ventured up the stairs and heard a faint sound, like the creaking of an old board, or maybe a distant whisper. When he got up, he saw an attic with only a few boxes and old dusty furniture. Nothing particularly remarkable, except for one thing: there was a small doll lying among all this junk. It looked relatively new and clearly did not fit the rest of the things that seemed to have been forgotten for a long time. Max slowly approached her and noticed that someone had carved something on the doll's forehead. The text was indecipherable, but the letters looked sloppy and hurried, as if the person wrote them in a hurry or in a state of great excitement. Trying to understand the meaning of the inscription, he turned on the camera, taking several pictures for further analysis. It was only when he came back down that he noticed another detail. In the corner of the room, strange lines and symbols resembling primitive drawings were painted on the wall, and something about their shape seemed familiar to him, as if he had seen it before in one of his past investigations. He had previously found echoes of these symbols in records of cult rituals left by long-abandoned communities. All this did not fit into my head. Before Max could sort out his own thoughts, he heard a sound that startled him. Someone was walking slowly through the house. The sound came from the direction of the corridor and was approaching. Max, holding his breath, felt a growing fear. It took him a split second to realize that someone had been watching him all this time. Max instinctively reached for the switch on the camera, but decided to leave it on. It is unknown what might be useful in the future. He pressed himself against the wall, trying not to make a sound, and listened. Silence. It seemed that the footsteps he had just heard were a figment of his imagination. However, a slight, barely audible rustle sounded again, as if someone was pulling a piece of cloth or rubber across the floor, and each time the sound got a little closer. Max slowly moved around the corner and pointed the flashlight in the direction of the sound. A dim light cut through the darkness, but there was no one in the hallway. He looked around again, feeling a chill run through his body. A dim light flashed on the stairs below, as if someone had opened the door to the street for a moment, and then slammed it again. The journalist had an uneasy feeling that the way back might be blocked. Trying not to panic, Max decided to go around all the rooms on the ground floor. As soon as he stepped into the next room, he noticed that one of the walls was covered with chalk marks, as if someone was making notches. Next to these lines were a few words written in uneven, tenacious letters. "I'm here. No one hears." Max took photos of the inscriptions, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Strangely, they reminded him of the recent news. The police were looking for a man who had disappeared in the area several months ago, but no trace was found. While Max was examining the inscriptions, his gaze fell on one of the doors. It was slightly ajar and, as if inviting him, creaked when he touched it. He entered a small room, barely illuminated by the streetlight. There was almost no furniture here, except for an old desk, on which lay a pile of yellowed sheets of paper. They were notes written hastily, in places in scribbles, and sometimes in small, neat letters. Max collected them all to study in more detail. On some of the sheets there was a diary describing someone's feeling of anxiety, despair, and incomprehensible expectation. "They're watching," one of the pages said, "but no one notices." Max turned the sheet over and saw the last lines. "I can't leave. Something is keeping me from leaving this house." He had a vague suspicion that the author of the notes was the missing person who had never been found. When Max left the room, he noticed that someone had placed small rags and rags in narrow rows, as if creating some kind of system of labels or designations. He saw bloodstains on one of the old handkerchiefs. Now his thoughts were getting darker and darker. Why had Anonymous asked him to come here? And what was he hoping to find? Max decided it was time to leave. He took quick steps towards the exit, but when he reached the stairs, he realized that the door he had left ajar was now tightly closed. He pulled on the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if someone had locked her in from the outside. Max turned around abruptly and, panic-stricken, rushed back into the depths of the house in search of another exit. Ahead, he saw another door leading to the basement, and, finding no other way, decided to go downstairs. The basement was full of trash and old tools, but something else caught his attention. A rusty crate standing in the corner. Max came closer and opened it. There was a notebook with photos inside. He began to flip through the pages, and the further he read, the more tense he became. The photos showed people who looked like they were alive, but scared. Many of the pictures were taken in different parts of the house. This can't be true, he thought, but then the last entry caught his attention. It showed the place where he was now. The caption under the photo read, "Journalist." Max closed his notebook in a panic and rushed to the basement exit, but he had barely taken a few steps when he heard a knock behind him. He looked around, expecting to see something terrible, but all he saw was an old fan that had apparently turned on its own. My heart was pounding, but I had only one thought: I need to find a way out. After a few agonizing minutes, making his way through the corridors, Max saw a small window at the end of the room. The window looked big enough to fit through, and after breaking the glass with a flashlight, he got out, finally being free. He looked back at the house. There was a strange creaking sound, as if someone was rocking in a chair. Max, covered in cold sweat, ran down the street without looking back, only feeling with his back that this house would never forget him. Max ran down the dark street, looking over his shoulder, until he found himself in the lighted parking lot at the nearest gas station. The light of the lanterns seemed to be his salvation, and only there he finally stopped to catch his breath. With trembling hands, he took out his phone and checked the photos taken in the house. The pictures were clear, but with each new photo he became more and more anxious. A doll with letters carved on his forehead, mysterious inscriptions on the walls, a diary with notes about insane fear, and a photo with the caption "Journalist." This picture was especially disturbing. Max decided to return to the editorial office and prepare an article. He already had all the material: photographs, notes, personal impressions. He wanted to describe everything he saw, from strange symbols to creepy sounds. The only thing he didn't understand was why the anonymous person had sent him to that house. Whoever was behind this clearly had some idea of what was going on. Max began to suspect that the anonymous person could be a part of this story or even a witness to what happened to the missing people. Upon arrival at the editorial office, he immediately began to write an article. About an hour later, his phone rang again. An unknown number appeared on the screen. Reluctantly answering, Max heard the familiar voice of the anonymous person who sent him to an abandoned house. "How do you like the house?" A voice sounded, full of mockery and something subtle, disturbing. "Who are you? Why did you send me there?" Max tried to remain calm, but his voice was trembling treacherously. "You wanted to know the truth yourself, didn't you?" The other man laughed. "You saw what everyone should have seen." "What do you mean?" Max was almost shouting into the phone, but the anonymous voice had already disappeared. The call ended, leaving the journalist completely confused. A few days have passed. Max returned to his daily duties, although the story of the house haunted him. He tried to send the article to print, but the editor unexpectedly refused to publish it. "Listen, Max, this is not exactly the material we need," the editor said, choosing his words. "It looks like a fiction. It will cause a scandal." Max did not understand why the editor, who always supported his articles, refused to print the material. In the evening, when he was trying to revise the article again, a letter arrived at the editorial office, a handwritten note without a return address. On the sheet it was written, "You don't think you're going to get rid of this so easily, do you? You've seen more than you should have." A black and white photograph was attached to the note. The photo showed the same abandoned house, but only a face was clearly visible in the window on the second floor. His own face. Max froze, looking at the picture. He knew that someone had been watching him all this time. The next day, Max decided to take back control of the situation. He went to see his colleague, a retired detective, with whom he had long maintained friendly relations. Dan, experienced and knowledgeable, was the only person Max could trust with this story. "So you think it's not just an accident?" Dan asked, studying the photos and notes. "Maybe whoever sent you there really didn't want you to get out." Max nodded. He told Dan about the strange calls and the note with the photo. The detective listened attentively, and then, considering the situation, offered to return to the house together. Max hesitated, but the feeling that he had to get to the truth was stronger than fear. The next evening, the two of them arrived at the house. Dan, who was used to such situations, opened the door and cautiously examined the room. They did not find any traces of human presence. All the items were in their places, but one thing alerted them both. The room where Max found the notes looked a little different. The table and chair were moved, and a new inscription appeared on the wall. "You won't know the whole truth anyway." Suddenly, footsteps were heard again somewhere above. Dan motioned for Max to follow him, and they cautiously headed for the attic. When they got up, they saw an old chest that Max had not noticed before. Dan was the first to approach the chest and, after giving it a suspicious look, slowly opened the lid. There were strange things inside. Several dusty, yellowed photographs with images of those who, apparently, were the last residents of the house, a thick stack of handwritten notes, and an object that immediately caught Max's eye, an old dictaphone with a cassette inside. Without hesitation, Max took out his dictaphone and pressed the play button. The tape rustled, and then a voice rang out in the silence. Deep, hoarse, sounding like someone's appreciative monologue. "Do you know how it is? There are no walls in the house, but whole lives are locked up. And these lives, they won't go away. They're always here, you just don't see them. They don't want you to know that they're locked up. They did everything they could to keep us here. Just like you are now. This house doesn't let anyone out just like that." Max gripped the recorder tighter, his hands shaking. He glanced at Dan, but Dan also seemed to sense that something was wrong. But at that moment, a slight crackling sound came from the speaker and, finally, a long, eerily calm whisper. "Those who come here are already part of this place. And you're the new witness. You are the last witness." When they finished listening, Max and Dan left the trunk open and quickly headed for the exit. They were both uneasy, but the sense of danger was too acute to linger. After walking a few steps down the corridor, they heard the creak of the old floor behind them. Turning around, Max noticed how the door to the room where they had just been slammed shut on its own. "We're leaving now," Dan said, and they quickened their pace. When they reached the front door, another unexpected surprise awaited them. There was a shadow in the doorway, like a man who seemed to be waiting for them. Without hesitation, Dan took off and opened the door, and they ran out into the street without looking back. However, it didn't end there. The next morning, when Max returned home, he received another letter. This time it was a small envelope without signatures. Inside was a photo of her and Dan, taken in the same style as the previous one, black and white, slightly blurred. In this picture, they were standing in the very room they had run out of the night before, with empty, almost lifeless expressions on their faces. Max froze in disbelief. How could someone have filmed them from such close proximity? He felt something collapse inside him. He put the photo on the table and covered his face with his hands. Now he knew that no matter how far he went, no matter how hard he tried to forget this house, his presence remained with him forever.